Have you ever wondered why some of the greatest players in history never give you a simple answer when you ask them one simple question? Who was the greatest? You would think it should be easy. Count the titles, count the majors, look at the records, and the answer should reveal itself. But what if it never does? What if the deeper you look into the game, the less certain that answer becomes? What if greatness in golf was never meant to be measured in one way? Is it control? The ability to walk through 4 days of pressure without ever losing your rhythm? Is it imagination, seeing shots that no one else even considers, or is it something far less visible, something that does not show up on a scorecard at all? There was a moment late in his career when Nick Faldo believed he had done everything right. The course had been managed perfectly, every decision made with discipline, every shot played within a system he trusted, nothing rushed, nothing forced. It was the kind of round that on paper should have been enough, and yet, walking down the final stretch, something felt off. Not because he had made a mistake, but because somehow the tournament was no longer his. There was no single shot that changed it, no obvious collapse, just a quiet shift, a sense that somewhere someone else had taken control of the moment without breaking the surface of the game. That feeling stayed with him, because it forced a question he could not answer at the time. If you can play the game exactly the way it is supposed to be played, and still lose control of it, then what really defines greatness? Over the years, he stopped trying to reduce that question to a list, because every time he thought he had the answer, a different name would change it, not because they won more, but because they revealed something different about the game itself. There were 5 men who did that to him. 5 men who did not just compete against him, but changed how he understood what it meant to win. And once you see what each of them brought to the game, you start to realize why that question never had a simple answer. These were the 5 men who changed how he understood greatness. Before you understand the 5 men who reshaped his thinking, you have to understand the man who believed he already had the game figured out. Nick Faldo was never the loudest presence on the course. He did not rely on bursts of brilliance or moments of emotion to carry him through a tournament. What set him apart was something far less visible and far more difficult to break. Control. Not just over the ball, but over himself. Over the rhythm of a round. Over the decisions that most players made on instinct. Where others chased opportunities, he waited for them. Where others trusted feel, he trusted structure. By the time he reached his peak, the game had already entered what many would later call a golden era. The fields were deeper, the pressure heavier, the margins thinner. And yet, in that environment, Faldo built a reputation that did not depend on flair. He became the player who did not give shots away. The player who did not panic. The player who over 4 days would slowly move into position while others tried to force the issue too early. It was not always exciting to watch, but it was brutally effective. Inside the game that mattered more than anything, there was a quiet understanding among players. You did not need to see him leading early to know he was there. If he was within reach, going into the final stretch, the tournament was no longer stable. It could shift without warning, because he believed something very simple. That golf at its highest level could be solved, not perfectly, but consistently. If you built the right system, trusted it completely, and removed emotion from your decisions, you could outlast almost anyone. For a long time, that belief held. It brought him titles. It brought him respect. It built an identity that very few players could challenge. But it also created a limit he could not see yet, because the game he believed he understood was about to confront him with something else entirely. Not one player, but 5, each of them exposing a different weakness in that system, each of them forcing him to adjust, not just his game, but the way he thought about the game itself. If you believed golf was only about discipline and control, then what came next would not make sense. And that was exactly the point. Number 5. Jack Nicklaus. He was not the first opponent Faldo studied. He was the standard. Long before they stood on the same fairways, long before the same names appeared on leaderboards, there was already a quiet understanding inside the game. You did not measure yourself against the field. You measured yourself against him. That was the difference. With most players, you prepared for what they might do. With Nicklaus, you prepared for what the tournament might become once he was involved. It was never about a single shot, not power, not flair, nothing that could be easily isolated and explained. What made him so difficult to match was something far more subtle. He never seemed to be chasing the round. While others reacted to pressure, he appeared to be moving ahead of it. as if he already knew where the decisive moment would arrive and simply waited for it to come to him. That was the part that unsettled players like Faldo, because everything about Faldo's game was built on structure, on building around, step by step, on reducing uncertainty. But Nicklaus introduced a different kind of control. Not control over each shot. Control over time. There is a moment Faldo would often return to in his mind. The Masters, 1986. By then, many believed Nicklaus was no longer the central figure. The game had moved on. New players, new power, new expectations. And yet, as the final round unfolded, something began to shift. Not dramatically, quietly. He was not overpowering the course. He was not forcing anything. There were no reckless decisions, no visible urgency, just a series of choices, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. And slowly, almost without resistance, the tournament began to lean back toward him. That was the lesson, because for Faldo it challenged something fundamental. He had always believed that winning came from executing the right plan over 4 days, from maintaining discipline, from avoiding mistakes, but Nicklaus showed something else. That it was not about playing perfect golf. It was about playing the right golf at the right moment. And those are not the same thing. You could execute your system, hit your targets, stay within yourself, and still feel somewhere beneath the surface that the outcome was drifting away from you. Not because you were failing, but because someone else understood the timing of the game better than you did. That realization stayed with him, because it meant control was not absolute. It could be taken from you without you ever feeling the exact moment it happened. Nicklaus did not just win tournaments, he guided them. And once you understood that, you began to see why so many players, even at their best, felt like they were always one step behind him. Number 4. Seve Ballesteros. If Nicklaus made you feel one step behind, Seve made you question whether you were even playing the same game. Everything Faldo believed in was built on order, repetition, percentages. The idea that if you removed risk and trusted structure, the game would eventually bend in your favor. Seve did not follow any of that. He saw golf differently. Not as a sequence of correct decisions, but as a field of possibilities. There were shots most players would never attempt, angles they would never consider, situations where the only logical play was to get back into position and reset the hole. Seve looked at those same situations and saw opportunity. That was where the tension began. Because against most players, Faldo's system worked exactly as intended. You stayed patient, you built your round, you waited for mistakes, and over time the advantage would come. But Seve did not play long enough in any one position for that system to settle. He could be out of position, buried in rough, blocked by trees, standing in places where the percentage play said survival was the only option. And yet somehow those moments did not end the hole. They transformed it, not once, not rarely, often enough that it started to change how you felt standing over your own ball. Because while you were doing everything right, he was doing something unpredictable. And unpredictable does not follow structure. There was a moment that captured it perfectly. The Ryder Cup, 1987. That week did not feel like a normal tournament. Every shot carried weight beyond the scoreboard. The crowd was not just watching, they were part of the tension. Every reaction amplified what was happening on the course. Seve did not shrink in that environment. He expanded inside it. He was not just playing the hole. He was playing the moment, the energy, the pressure that surrounded every decision. You could feel it shift when he struck the ball, not just because of the shot itself, but because of what it did to everyone else. For Faldo, that created a different kind of problem. With Nicklaus, you could try to match control. With Seve, you could not match imagination. And once you accept that, you are left with something uncomfortable. You can play your game exactly as planned. You can execute every shot within your system, and still feel like control is slipping because somewhere, something unexpected is about to happen. That is not a mistake you can correct. That is a reality you have to live with. Seve forced Faldo to become even more disciplined, not because discipline could defeat him, but because it was the only thing that could hold together against that kind of unpredictability. Even then, there was always a thought in the back of your mind. If he finds something here, everything changes. And sometimes he did. Not because the percentages were on his side, but because he believed in a shot no one else could see. And in those moments, golf stopped being a system. It became instinct. Number 3, Tom Watson. If Seve introduced unpredictability, Watson introduced something even more difficult to solve: conditions. There is a version of golf that exists only on links courses: wind that never settles, lies that never repeat, fairways that do not reward perfect shots the way you expect them to, a surface that forces you to accept outcomes you cannot fully control. Most players endure those conditions. Watson understood them. That was the difference Faldo could not ignore. Early in his career, Faldo believed that a well-built swing repeated with discipline could hold up anywhere, that if you stayed committed to structure, the variables would eventually cancel themselves out. Links golf did not work that way. The wind did not care about your structure. The ground did not respond the same way twice. The ball did not always stay in the air long enough to behave predictably. And yet when Watson stepped into those conditions, everything seemed to slow down. Not because the course became easier, but because he stopped fighting it. He shaped shots into the wind instead of through it. He kept the ball low when others tried to lift it. He used the ground as part of the shot, letting the ball run, bounce, and settle into places that looked intentional even when the surface itself was unpredictable. Watching it, you could mistake it for simplicity. Trying to do it yourself, you realized how precise it had to be. That was where the shift happened for Faldo. Because this was not about imagination like Seve, and not about timing like Nicklaus. This was about adaptation. Letting go of the idea that the game could always be controlled the same way. There were moments, especially in the Open Championship, where Faldo could feel the difference clearly. You could be working hard just to hold your round together, measuring every decision, adjusting for wind, for bounce, for uncertainty. And then you would look ahead and see Watson walking down the fairway as if the course had already accepted him. That creates its own kind of pressure, because you are not just competing against another player, you are competing against someone who looks completely at ease in an environment that is making everyone else uncomfortable. That forces a different question. Not how well you can execute your system, but whether your system belongs in that environment at all. Watson did not abandon discipline. He expanded it. He added feel, awareness, the ability to read conditions not as obstacles but as part of the game itself. For Faldo, that realization came slowly. It was not a single round or a single loss. It was a pattern, a growing understanding that there were versions of the game where control alone was not enough, where you had to adapt or be left behind. And once you accept that, you are no longer trying to master one version of golf, you are trying to survive all of them. Number 2. Gary Player. If Watson forced you to adapt to the course, Gary Player forced you to confront something you could not fix during a round: preparation. At first glance, there was nothing overwhelming about him. He was not the biggest, not the longest, not the most naturally imposing figure on the course. But over time, something became impossible to ignore. He never faded, not across 4 days, not across a season, not even across decades. That was where the pressure began. Because most players measured themselves by how well they could play at their best: a perfect round, a strong week, a moment where everything aligned. Player was not built around moments. He was built around endurance. He traveled constantly, different continents, different grasses, different climates. He adapted to conditions that many players would never experience in a single career. And instead of wearing him down, it sharpened him. That created a different kind of gap. You could match him shot for shot, but you could not easily match the work behind those shots. There is a round Faldo often thought about. The Masters, 1974. Going into the final day, Player was not the obvious choice, not the favorite, not the name everyone expected to emerge. But he did not need to dominate the field in a single burst. He applied pressure in a way that was harder to see. One hole at a time, one decision at a time. No urgency, no panic, just a steady accumulation that gradually shifted the balance of the tournament. And when the moment came, he was already in position. That was the difference. Because this was not about imagination like Seve or adaptation like Watson. This was about how much of the game happens before the round even begins. Faldo had built his career on discipline, but Player expanded the meaning of that word. Discipline was not just about staying patient under pressure. It was about how you trained, how you traveled, how you prepared your body, how long you could maintain that level when others began to drop away. Those things do not show up on a leaderboard until they do. And by then, it is too late to catch up. That was the uncomfortable truth. You cannot solve that problem on the course. You cannot adjust to it in the middle of a round. Because by the time you recognize it, the gap has already been created somewhere else. Player did not overwhelm you with one part of his game. He outlasted you with all of it. And once Faldo understood that, the definition of greatness shifted again. It was no longer just about how well you could play. It was about how long you could sustain it. Number 1. Greg Norman. With the others, Faldo had observed, adjusted, learned. With Norman there was no distance. This was direct. They stood on the same fairways, played in the same final groups, felt the same pressure building at the same time. There was no need to interpret what he was. You experienced it. From the beginning, the contrast was clear. Faldo built control slowly through discipline. Norman imposed himself immediately. He played with a kind of freedom that did not wait for the tournament to develop. He attacked lines others avoided. He trusted his natural ability in moments where most players would hesitate. And when it worked, it changed everything around him. Because pressure in golf does not always come from the score. Sometimes it comes from presence. When Norman was playing well, you were no longer just executing your own plan. You were reacting, adjusting, questioning decisions you would normally trust. That was the trap. Because the moment you step outside your own game to match someone else's rhythm, you are no longer in control. There is one moment that defined all of it. The Masters, 1996. Going into the final round, Norman had built a lead that looked secure. He had played with authority all week. From the outside, it seemed like a matter of time before the tournament closed around him. Faldo saw it differently. Not as a deficit to chase with something extraordinary, but as a situation to manage. There was no need to force anything, no need to respond to aggression with aggression, only a need to stay within himself and allow the round to unfold. What followed was not a single turning point. It was a gradual shift, small moments, subtle changes, decisions that did not look dramatic on their own but began to alter the balance over time. That is how Augusta works. It does not always break you in one moment. It moves slowly until you realize the ground has shifted beneath you. And as that shift happened, Faldo did not change. He did not chase. He held his position. That was the lesson Norman taught him. Because against a player like that, the instinct is to respond, to match the pace, to fight fire with fire. But that only pulls you into a game that does not belong to you. The real challenge is to remain where you are. To trust that patience held long enough becomes pressure in its own way. Norman did not just test your skill. He tested your identity as a player, whether you would stay true to it or abandon it under pressure. And sometimes winning had nothing to do with doing something extraordinary. It came from not breaking, from holding your ground long enough for the moment to arrive. And when it did, being ready to take it without hesitation. That was the final shift. Greatness was not only about control, imagination, adaptation, or endurance. It was about presence. The kind that forces everyone else to respond, even when they know they should not. There is one name that never fits neatly into the structure, not because he does not belong, but because he belongs in a different way. Arnold Palmer was not defined by how he competed against Faldo. Their eras did not fully overlap at their peaks. There were no long stretches of direct battles, no repeated Sundays where one had to outplay the other. And yet, when you step back and look at the game as a whole, you realize something immediately. You cannot tell the story without him. Not if you are being honest. Faldo's first awareness of Palmer did not come from competition. It came from the way people spoke about him, the way crowds followed him, the way tournaments seemed to change when he was present. There was something different in how the game felt around him. It was no longer just about what happened between the tee and the green. It became something people connected to, something they cared about beyond the result. That shift cannot be measured in titles alone. There is a moment often pointed to. The Open Championship, 1960. Palmer's decision to play, to embrace that stage, did more than add another name to the field. It helped carry the game beyond its traditional boundaries. It brought attention, energy, and a sense that golf was no longer confined to one place or one audience. That matters. Because players like Faldo entered a world that had already been expanded. The spotlight was brighter. The stakes felt larger. The game itself carried more weight. And that does not happen by accident. It happens because someone before you changed the scale of it. That is why Palmer does not sit comfortably next to the others. Because if you try to measure him the same way, you miss the point. He was not just part of the competition. He reshaped what the competition meant. For Faldo, that introduced a final realization. Greatness is not only about how you play, it is also about what you leave behind for the game itself, the way people experience it, the way it reaches beyond the course. And once you understand that the idea of ranking everyone the same way begins to fall apart, Palmer was not simply one of the greats. He was part of the reason greatness could be seen at all. By the time you reach the end of those names, the original question no longer feels the same. Who was the greatest? It sounds simple when you first hear it. It never stays that way, because each of them revealed something different about the game. Jack Nicklaus showed that control is not just about execution, but about knowing when a tournament will be decided and being there when it happens. Seve Ballesteros proved that logic is not the only path, that imagination can create opportunities where none should exist. Tom Watson made it clear that the game does not always bend to your system. Sometimes you have to bend to the game. Gary Player redefined discipline, not as something you rely on in moments, but something you build over a lifetime. Greg Norman embodied presence, the kind that forces everyone else to respond even when they know they should not. And Arnold Palmer, he reminded you that the game is larger than any one player, that greatness can exist beyond results, beyond records, beyond anything that can be counted. When you place all of that side by side, something becomes clear. You are not looking at a list, you are looking at a map, each of them pointing in a different direction, each of them showing a different way to understand what it means to win. And once you see that, the idea of choosing one above the others begins to lose its meaning, because they were never trying to define the same thing. They were building the game in different ways. That is why Faldo never gave a simple answer, not because he could not choose, but because he understood that the question itself was incomplete. Greatness in golf does not arrive in a single form, and it does not leave you with a single name. It leaves you with something far more difficult, an understanding that the game is shaped by those who change it in ways that cannot always be measured. And once you understand that, you stop looking for one answer, because you realize there was never meant to be one.